The morning sun cast long shadows across Forward Operating Base Meridian as Fay Robinson stood at the perimeter wall, her pale hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had grown lukewarm in the crisp European air. At 22, she possessed the kind of quiet intensity that made others uncomfortable, speaking only when necessary and moving through the base like a ghost in combat fatigues. What her fellow soldiers couldn't see was the storm brewing behind her contemplative gray eyes, or how this unassuming woman would soon lead 50 soldiers through the most decisive battle their unit had ever faced. Fay Robinson had been stationed at Forward Operating Base Meridian for 14 months, and in all that time she could count the number of meaningful conversations she'd had with her fellow soldiers on one hand. It wasn't that she was unfriendly, exactly. She responded when spoken to, completed every task with meticulous precision, and never caused trouble. But in a world where camaraderie was built on loud jokes, shared complaints, and boisterous storytelling, Fay's quiet nature made her practically invisible. The base, nestled in the rolling hills of Eastern Europe near a contested border region, housed 200 soldiers from various NATO countries. The landscape around them was deceptively peaceful, with wildflower meadows stretching toward distant tree lines and villages that looked like postcards. But beneath this pastoral facade lay a complex web of territorial disputes and insurgent activity that kept everyone on edge. Fay spent her days in the communications center, monitoring radio chatter and processing intelligence reports. Her official role was Communications Specialist Grade 3, which meant she sat in a windowless room filled with humming equipment, translating intercepted transmissions and tracking troop movements on digital maps. It was important work, but it was also solitary work that suited her temperament perfectly. Her commanding officers appreciated her efficiency. Captain Morrison, the base communications director, often praised her accuracy and attention to detail in his reports. But praise for technical competence was different from respect for leadership potential. When promotion opportunities arose, when special assignments were distributed, when teams were formed for complex operations, Fay's name never appeared on the lists. The other soldiers had their theories about her silence. Some thought she was stuck up, too good to engage in their crude humor and endless speculation about home. Others assumed she was scared, overwhelmed by the military environment and counting down the days until her deployment ended. A few simply forgot she existed until they needed something translated or a communication system repaired. Sergeant Klaus Weber, a veteran German soldier who served as the base's unofficial social coordinator, had tried multiple times to draw Fay into group activities. He'd invite her to join the weekly card games, the impromptu soccer matches, the evening gatherings where soldiers shared stories and complaints. Each time, Fay would decline politely, offering a soft, "Thank you, but I have reports to finish," or "perhaps another time." Weber eventually gave up, shrugging to his friends that some people were just meant to be loners. What he didn't understand was that Fay's silence wasn't born from antisocial tendencies or fear. It came from a different source entirely, one that ran much deeper than mere personality quirks. Growing up in rural Scotland, Fay had learned early that words were powerful things that shouldn't be wasted. Her father, a career military officer, had taught her to observe before speaking, to think before acting, and to never make promises she couldn't keep. Her mother, a literature professor, had shown her that the most profound truths often lived in the spaces between words, in the pauses that gave meaning weight. This upbringing had shaped her into someone who processed the world differently. While others filled silence with chatter, she filled it with analysis. While others bonded through shared complaints, she built understanding through careful observation. And while others sought attention through loud gestures, she earned respect through quiet competence. But military culture, especially in combat zones, didn't always reward quiet competence. Leadership was associated with charisma, with the ability to rally troops through inspiring speeches and bold gestures. The officers who advanced were the ones who commanded rooms with their presence, who could motivate soldiers through sheer force of personality. Fay understood this dynamic, had studied it during her months at the base. She watched as Lieutenant Davis, a boisterous American with a talent for storytelling, was selected to lead increasingly important missions. She observed as Lieutenant Kowalski, a Polish officer known for his rousing speeches, earned commendations and promotions. She noted how even junior officers who could work a crowd were given opportunities that she, with her years of tactical training and strategic thinking, would never be considered for. The irony wasn't lost on her. In her communications role, she probably understood the strategic situation better than anyone else on the base. She monitored enemy movements, tracked supply lines, and analyzed patterns that others missed. Her reports had prevented 3 separate ambushes and identified 2 major insurgent supply caches. But this background knowledge, this comprehensive understanding of the battlefield, was seen as technical skill rather than leadership potential. Morning briefing in the base's main conference room followed the same predictable pattern that Fay had observed for over a year. Major Harrison, the base commander, stood at the head of a long table surrounded by his senior staff and unit leaders. Maps covered every available wall surface, marked with colored pins that represented friendly forces, enemy positions, and areas of strategic importance. Fay sat in the back row, her standard position for these mandatory briefings. She brought her notebook, as always, though her role rarely required active participation. She was there to listen, to absorb information that might be relevant to her communications duties, and to remain available if technical questions arose about radio capabilities or signal intelligence. "Gentlemen," Major Harrison began, his voice carrying the authority of 25 years in uniform, "we've received new intelligence about insurgent activity in the Moravian Valley sector. Their supply lines have shifted, and we need to adjust our patrol patterns accordingly." The briefing continued with the usual cast of characters playing their familiar roles. Lieutenant Colonel Brennan, the operations chief, provided tactical assessments with the confidence of someone who'd never been wrong in public. Captain Rodriguez outlined logistics concerns in rapid-fire Spanish-accented English that somehow made every problem sound urgent but manageable. And the unit commanders, all men with voices trained to carry across parade grounds, offered their perspectives on mission capabilities and troop readiness. Fay listened to their discussion about the Moravian Valley with growing interest. She'd been tracking communications in that sector for weeks and had identified patterns that suggested the insurgents were using a completely different strategy than what the briefing described. Her analysis indicated that they weren't simply shifting supply lines, but were actually preparing for a coordinated offensive that would target multiple NATO positions simultaneously. She documented this assessment in her reports, complete with intercepted communications, pattern analysis, and recommended countermeasures. But reports, especially those written by quiet communications specialists, had a way of getting buried in the chain of command. Technical intelligence was viewed as supporting information, not strategic insight. As the briefing progressed, Major Harrison announced the formation of a special reconnaissance team to investigate the insurgent activities. "I need leaders who can think on their feet, who can inspire confidence in their men, and who can handle the unexpected complications that always arise in the field." The selection process was as predictable as sunrise. Lieutenant Davis was chosen to lead the mission, his natural charisma and proven ability to motivate troops making him the obvious choice. Captain Kowalski would serve as his second, bringing tactical experience and the kind of commanding presence that soldiers instinctively followed. Sergeant Weber would handle communications liaison, his genial personality making him ideal for coordinating with local units. Each selection was logical, defensible, and completely ignored the possibility that leadership might take forms other than loud confidence and gregarious charm.
Fay watched as the chosen officers exchanged satisfied nods, already beginning to plan their approach to what they saw as a relatively straightforward reconnaissance mission. "Robinson," Major Harrison's voice cut through her observations, "you'll provide communication support from base, monitor their transmissions, and relay any intelligence updates that might affect the mission." Communication support from base. Again. Fay nodded acknowledgement, her expression neutral despite the familiar disappointment that settled in her chest. She'd monitored dozens of missions from the safety of her windowless room, providing technical support while others earned recognition for fieldwork she could have performed better than most of them. After the briefing dispersed, she lingered near the maps, studying the marked positions and proposed patrol routes. Her analysis suggested that the reconnaissance team was walking into a carefully prepared trap. But who would listen to the quiet communications specialist who never spoke up during briefings? "Something interesting about the terrain, Robinson?" Lieutenant Davis approached with the casual confidence of someone accustomed to being the center of attention. His question was friendly enough, but carried an undertone that suggested he was humoring her rather than genuinely seeking her opinion. "The elevation changes in Sector 7 create natural choke points," Fay replied quietly. "If I were planning an ambush, I'd position forces here, here, and here." She pointed to 3 locations on the map that would give insurgents clear fields of fire while providing multiple escape routes. Davis studied her suggestions with the polite attention of someone who had no intention of changing his plans. "Interesting theory. We'll keep that in mind during our reconnaissance." His tone made it clear that her input, while noted, wouldn't influence their actual approach. As Davis walked away to join his selected team members, she heard fragments of their conversation that confirmed her fears. They were treating the mission as a routine patrol, expecting to find evidence of shifted supply routes rather than preparing for the coordinated offensive that her intelligence suggested was imminent. She returned to her communications center and pulled up the files she'd been compiling. Weeks of intercepted communications, decoded messages, and pattern analysis painted a clear picture of insurgent intentions. They weren't merely adjusting their logistics, they were preparing for a major assault that would target multiple NATO positions simultaneously. The reconnaissance mission was walking directly into the opening phase of that assault. Fay stared at her computer screen, weighing her options. She could file another report, add it to the stack of technical assessments that might or might not reach decision-makers in time. She could request a meeting with Major Harrison, though her previous attempts to brief senior staff had been politely dismissed as communications personnel exceeding their role. Or she could accept that her insights, no matter how accurate, would continue to be overlooked because they came from someone too quiet to command attention in a world that equated leadership with volume. The afternoon sun streamed through the small window in her workspace, casting geometric patterns across the maps and reports scattered on her desk. Outside, she could hear the normal sounds of base life. Vehicles moving, personnel calling to each other, the distant hum of generators that kept their digital world functioning. It was a peaceful scene, almost pastoral in its normalcy. But Fay's trained ear could detect undertones that others missed. Radio chatter had subtle changes in frequency and timing. Supply convoy schedules showed minor adjustments that, when viewed collectively, suggested preparation for something significant. The enemy was coming, and the people responsible for defending against them were walking into a trap because nobody listened to the quiet woman who understood the intelligence better than anyone else on the base.
3 days after the reconnaissance mission departed, Fay found herself watching the aftermath from her position in the communications center. The mission had proceeded exactly as she'd predicted, with devastating results that could have been prevented if anyone had listened to her analysis. Lieutenant Davis and his team had walked directly into the ambush she'd warned about. Insurgent forces had been waiting at the exact choke points she'd identified, turning what should have been a routine reconnaissance into a desperate fighting retreat. Davis had been wounded in the opening minutes. Captain Kowalski had taken shrapnel to his leg, and Sergeant Weber had spent 6 hours calling for emergency extraction while pinned down in terrain that offered minimal cover. The rescue operation had eventually succeeded, but at a cost that left the entire base shaken. 2 soldiers were in critical condition, medical supplies were running low, and the insurgents had gained valuable intelligence about NATO response times and capabilities. Worst of all, the reconnaissance had failed to gather the information it was supposed to collect, leaving command blind to the true scope of the threat they were facing. Fay monitored the emergency communications throughout the crisis, her quiet competence keeping vital channels open while chaos erupted around the base. She coordinated with medical evacuation helicopters, relayed status updates to regional command, and maintained contact with scattered friendly units that might have been affected by the ambush. Her steady professionalism during the emergency earned quiet recognition from the senior communications staff, but recognition for technical performance was different from acknowledgement of strategic insight. The debriefing session took place in the same conference room where the mission had been planned, but the atmosphere was markedly different. Major Harrison's usual confidence had been replaced by grim determination, and the easy camaraderie among his staff had given way to tense professionalism. Maps still covered the walls, but now they were marked with red zones indicating confirmed enemy positions and casualty sites. Fay sat in her customary position at the back of the room, her notebook open but her pen motionless. She'd already written her technical report on communications performance during the emergency, documenting response times and equipment functionality with her characteristic precision. But the report she really wanted to write, the one that analyzed why the ambush had been so predictable and preventable, would never be officially submitted. "The insurgents demonstrated better intelligence about our movements than we anticipated," Major Harrison began, his voice carrying the weight of command responsibility. "They knew our patrol routes, our timing, and our response protocols. We need to understand how they acquired this information and adjust our security accordingly." Lieutenant Colonel Brennan shuffled through his folders, searching for explanations that would make sense of the tactical failure. "Their positioning suggests advanced reconnaissance of our standard procedures. They may have infiltrated local informants or intercepted our preliminary communications." Fay's grip tightened on her pen. The insurgents hadn't needed informants or intercepted communications to predict NATO movements. They'd simply recognized the patterns that she'd been documenting for weeks, the same patterns that made their forces predictable to anyone who bothered to analyze the comprehensive intelligence picture rather than focusing on narrow tactical details. Captain Rodriguez, speaking despite the bandages covering his shrapnel wounds, offered his perspective on the ambush. "They hit us with coordinated fire from 3 positions, just like a textbook envelopment. Professional execution, not the kind of random harassment we usually encounter in that sector." The discussion continued with each officer contributing pieces of the tactical puzzle, but none of them addressed the fundamental intelligence failure that had made the ambush possible. They were treating the incident as an unfortunate encounter with unusually competent insurgents, rather than the predictable result of inadequate strategic analysis. As the debriefing progressed, Fay heard fragments of conversation that revealed how her colleagues were processing the failure. Some blamed inadequate reconnaissance, others pointed to equipment limitations, and a few suggested insurgent capabilities had been systematically underestimated. But none of them mentioned the intelligence assessments that had predicted exactly this type of coordinated offensive. "We need fresh perspectives on insurgent tactics," Major Harrison concluded. "I'm requesting additional intelligence analysts from regional command to help us understand what we're facing." Fresh perspectives. Fay almost smiled at the irony. The perspective they needed had been sitting in the communications center for 14 months, filing reports that accurately predicted enemy behavior while being systematically ignored because she lacked the personality traits that military culture associated with strategic thinking. After the official debriefing ended, she lingered in the conference room, studying the updated maps that showed confirmed insurgent positions.
Her analysis had been vindicated by tragic events, but vindication felt hollow when it came at the cost of wounded colleagues and operational failure. "Terrible business," Sergeant Weber approached her, his arm in a sling from his injuries during the ambush. "Never seen anything like the coordination they showed out there, almost like they knew exactly what we were going to do." "They did know," Fay replied quietly, her voice barely audible in the empty conference room. "The patterns were all there in the communications intelligence. Coordinated movements, synchronized timing, strategic positioning. They weren't reacting to our reconnaissance, they were preparing for it." The German sergeant studied her with newfound interest. "You saw this coming?" "I documented it. Weeks ago. The intelligence was clear about their intentions, but intelligence reports don't carry the same weight as tactical assessments from field commanders." As Weber walked away, clearly troubled by their conversation, Fay remained in the conference room, staring at maps that now confirmed everything she'd predicted. The insurgents were preparing for a larger offensive. The reconnaissance ambush had been merely the opening move in a campaign designed to test NATO responses and gather intelligence about defensive capabilities. Her analysis suggested that the next phase would involve simultaneous attacks on multiple positions, designed to overwhelm response capabilities and create gaps in the defensive line. The base communications center would become a critical target, not just for its equipment, but for the intelligence databases that contain detailed information about friendly force positions and capabilities. She could write another report, document her assessments with the same meticulous precision that had characterized all her previous work. But reports from quiet communication specialists about strategic threats would receive the same attention as her warnings about the reconnaissance ambush, filed away as technical information rather than treated as actionable intelligence. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the conference room windows, highlighting dust motes that danced in the still air. Outside, she could hear the normal sounds of base operations continuing despite the morning's crisis. Vehicle engines, radio chatter, and the distant sound of helicopters that might be bringing the additional intelligence analysts that Major Harrison had requested. Professional analysts who would arrive, study the intelligence that she'd been processing for months, and eventually reach the same conclusions about insurgent intentions and capabilities. The only difference would be that their recommendations would carry the weight of official credibility, while hers had been dismissed as the overreaching of a communications specialist who didn't understand her proper role.
While her colleagues recovered from the reconnaissance disaster and waited for additional intelligence analysts to arrive from regional command, Fay embarked on a different kind of preparation. Her official duties continued unchanged, monitoring communications and processing intelligence reports with the same meticulous precision that had always characterized her work. But after hours, when the base settled into its evening routine, she began developing capabilities that extended far beyond her assigned role. The base library, tucked into a converted storage room in the administrative building, received little attention from most personnel. Soldiers preferred entertainment that didn't involve reading tactical manuals or strategic assessments. But for Fay, the library became a treasure trove of information that supplemented her growing understanding of the strategic situation they faced. She studied historical accounts of insurgent campaigns, focusing on cases where conventional forces had been defeated by smaller, more mobile opponents. The patterns were remarkably consistent across different conflicts and geographical regions. Insurgent success typically relied on superior intelligence, local knowledge, and the ability to force conventional forces into reactive positions where their technological advantages became liabilities. NATO forces in the region possessed overwhelming superiority in firepower, communications, and logistics, but these advantages were meaningless if insurgent forces could choose the time and place of engagement, forcing battles in terrain and circumstances that negated technological superiority. The reconnaissance ambush had demonstrated exactly this principle, with insurgents using their knowledge of local terrain to neutralize NATO advantages in equipment and training. Fay's analysis of intercepted communications revealed that the insurgents understood NATO capabilities better than NATO understood insurgent intentions. They'd conducted months of careful observation, documenting response times, standard procedures, and tactical preferences. Their intelligence network included not just local informants, but sophisticated analysis of NATO communications patterns and operational procedures. This realization led her to a troubling conclusion. The insurgents weren't simply reacting to NATO presence in the region. They were implementing a comprehensive campaign designed to systematically neutralize NATO effectiveness. The reconnaissance ambush had been a test, designed to confirm their assessments of NATO capabilities and gather real-time intelligence about response procedures. Her technical analysis suggested that the next phase would involve simultaneous attacks on multiple targets designed to overwhelm NATO's ability to coordinate effective responses. Communications centers would be priority targets, not just for their equipment, but for the intelligence they contained. Forward operating bases like Meridian would face coordinated assaults designed to force evacuation or surrender. But this analysis, like all her previous assessments, would carry little weight if presented through normal channels. Communications specialists weren't supposed to engage in strategic planning or tactical assessment. Her role was to process information, not to interpret its broader implications or recommend operational responses. So instead of writing another report that would be filed away and forgotten, Fay began developing the capabilities she would need to act on her intelligence when the crisis inevitably came. She studied the base's defensive positions, memorizing fields of fire, supply routes, and potential vulnerabilities. She analyzed the terrain around the base, identifying approaches that insurgent forces might use and defensive positions that could be established if conventional perimeter defenses were compromised. Her evening runs, previously dismissed by her colleagues as eccentric exercise habits, became reconnaissance missions that familiarized her with every ridge, valley, and potential fighting position within 5 kilometers of the base. She timed routes between critical locations, identified alternative communications positions, and mentally rehearsed the movements that would be necessary if the base came under coordinated attack. The base armory, officially accessible only to designated personnel, became another focus of her preparation. Her communications role required familiarity with radio equipment, but military communication systems were often integrated with defensive systems in ways that provided legitimate access to broader tactical information. She used this access to study weapon positions, ammunition supplies, and defensive procedures that might become critical if the base faced the kind of assault that her intelligence suggested was inevitable. Sergeant First Class Patricia Hayes, the base's senior armorer, noticed Fay's increased interest in defensive systems but interpreted it as professional development rather than unauthorized preparation. "Good to see communications personnel taking interest in the broader tactical picture," Hayes commented during one of Fay's equipment inspections. "Too many specialists get tunnel vision about their narrow responsibilities." Fay nodded politely, accepting the praise while continuing her methodical examination of defensive positions and weapon systems. Hayes's comment revealed exactly the kind of thinking that had led to the reconnaissance disaster. Specialists were expected to maintain narrow focus on their assigned duties, while broader tactical awareness was reserved for designated leaders who might not have access to the detailed intelligence that specialists processed daily. Her preparation extended beyond physical familiarity with base defenses. She began studying the personnel files and capability assessments of every soldier stationed at the base, building a comprehensive understanding of skills, experience levels, and leadership potential that existed within the unit. Most soldiers had been trained for specific roles, but many possessed additional capabilities that weren't reflected in their official assignments. Private Matthews, officially a vehicle mechanic, had completed advanced marksmanship training and served as a designated marksman in his previous unit.
Corporal Singh, assigned to logistics duties, had extensive experience in demolitions and explosive ordnance disposal. Specialist Chen, working in the medical facility, had completed combat medic training that qualified her for battlefield casualty care under fire. These hidden capabilities represented resources that could be crucial if the base faced the kind of assault that conventional defensive planning didn't anticipate. But identifying these resources was different from developing the authority to coordinate their use. Fay might understand who could do what, but she lacked the official position that would allow her to organize these capabilities into an effective defensive response. Her analysis of the personnel situation revealed another troubling pattern. The senior leadership that would normally coordinate defensive responses had been systematically degraded by recent events. Lieutenant Davis remained hospitalized with injuries from the reconnaissance mission. Captain Kowalski was on limited duty due to his wounds. Major Harrison was focused on political damage control, managing the fallout from the intelligence failure while waiting for replacement personnel from regional command. The result was a leadership vacuum that existed at exactly the wrong time. Her intelligence indicated that insurgent forces were preparing for their next phase of operations, but the base's ability to respond effectively had been compromised by the loss of experienced leaders and the failure to recognize the broader strategic threat they faced. As she walked back to her quarters after another evening of reconnaissance and analysis, Fay reflected on the irony of her situation. She probably understood the tactical situation better than anyone else on the base, had identified capabilities and resources that could be crucial for survival, and had developed comprehensive assessments of the threats they would soon face. The challenge wasn't technical competence or strategic understanding. The challenge was overcoming a military culture that equated leadership with personality traits she didn't possess, and finding a way to coordinate defensive responses despite lacking the official authority that would make such coordination legitimate.
The replacement intelligence analysts arrived on a gray morning that matched Fay's mood as she watched their convoy navigate the base's security checkpoints. 3 vehicles carrying specialists from regional command, complete with advanced analytical equipment and the kind of official credentials that would ensure their assessments received immediate attention from senior leadership. Captain James Mitchell, the lead analyst, possessed exactly the kind of commanding presence that military culture associated with expertise. Tall, confident, and articulate, he moved through the base with the assurance of someone whose opinions carried weight. His team included 2 junior analysts and a technical specialist, all bearing the unmistakable confidence of personnel whose reports would be read, discussed, and acted upon. Fay attended their initial briefing as a technical resource, her role limited to explaining communication systems and providing access to intercepted intelligence. She sat in her familiar position at the back of the conference room, watching as the new analysts examined the same information she'd been processing for months. "Interesting patterns in the communications intelligence," Captain Mitchell observed, studying printouts of intercepted transmissions. "The insurgents demonstrate sophisticated understanding of our operational procedures. Their timing and positioning suggest access to detailed intelligence about our capabilities." The assessment was accurate, but incomplete. Mitchell was identifying symptoms rather than analyzing the underlying strategic framework that made insurgent success predictable. His focus on tactical details missed the broader pattern of coordinated preparation that Fay's analysis had revealed weeks earlier. "Specialist Robinson has been processing this intelligence stream," Major Harrison indicated Fay with a gesture. "She can provide context about collection methods and source reliability." Mitchell turned toward Fay with polite professional interest. "Any observations about changes in communication patterns or operational indicators?" The question offered an opening that Fay had been waiting for, an opportunity to present her comprehensive analysis to someone who might actually listen. But Mitchell's tone suggested he was seeking technical clarification rather than strategic assessment. His body language indicated that he viewed her as a resource to be consulted, rather than a colleague to be engaged.
"The patterns suggest coordinated preparation for a multi-phase operation," Fay replied, her voice steady despite the importance of the moment. "The timing, geographical distribution, and communication protocols indicate systematic intelligence gathering, followed by operational planning for simultaneous attacks on multiple targets." Mitchell nodded with the patience of someone accustomed to receiving input from technical specialists who didn't understand the broader context of their work. "Useful observations. We'll incorporate that technical assessment into our comprehensive analysis." Technical assessment. The phrase hit Fay like a dismissal disguised as acknowledgement. Her months of careful analysis, her identification of patterns that had predicted the reconnaissance disaster, her understanding of insurgent capabilities and intentions, all of it reduced to technical input that would be filtered through the interpretations of analysts who'd spent 3 days studying intelligence she'd been processing for over a year. The briefing continued with Mitchell's team presenting their preliminary findings, conclusions that largely confirmed Fay's previous assessments, while being credited to the superior analytical capabilities of the regional command specialists. They identified the same coordination patterns, predicted similar tactical developments, and recommended defensive preparations that Fay had been advocating for weeks. The difference was in how their recommendations were received. When Mitchell suggested enhanced perimeter security, Major Harrison immediately ordered defensive improvements. When the junior analysts recommended changes to patrol patterns, unit commanders began revising their operational procedures. When the technical specialists advised communication security upgrades, resources were allocated for immediate implementation. Fay watched this transformation with a mixture of vindication and frustration that threatened to overwhelm her professional composure. The intelligence that had been dismissed as technical observation when she presented it was now being treated as actionable strategic assessment when delivered by analysts with appropriate credentials and commanding personalities. After the briefing, she returned to her communications center and stared at the reports she'd compiled over the previous months. Detailed analyses that had predicted insurgent capabilities, identified tactical patterns, and recommended defensive preparations. All of it accurate, all of it ignored, and all of it now being rediscovered by analysts whose expertise was measured by their ability to present information in ways that military culture found credible. Captain Mitchell appeared in her workspace that afternoon, accompanied by one of his junior analysts. "Specialist Robinson, we'd like to review your collection logs and processing procedures. Understanding your methods will help us validate our assessments." The request was reasonable and professional, but it highlighted the fundamental disconnect between technical competence and strategic credibility. Mitchell needed her information but didn't value her analysis. He recognized her skill at collecting and processing intelligence, but couldn't conceive that those same skills might qualify her to interpret the strategic implications of what she'd discovered. The insurgent communications show preparation for coordinated operations targeting multiple NATO positions, Fay explained as she guided them through her analytical databases. The timing sequences suggest they're planning simultaneous attacks designed to overwhelm response capabilities and create gaps in the defensive line. "Solid technical work," Mitchell replied, making notes in his tablet. "We'll factor your collection results into our strategic assessment of insurgent capabilities and likely courses of action." Her collection results, not her strategic assessment, not her analytical conclusions, but her collection results that would be interpreted by analysts who understood the proper relationship between information gathering and decision-making. The distinction was subtle but profound, representing the difference between being valued as a resource and respected as a professional. As Mitchell and his team departed, Fay reflected on the broader implications of what she'd witnessed. Her intelligence had been vindicated, but in a way that reinforced her exclusion from strategic decision-making. The system had proven capable of recognizing accurate analysis, but only when it came from sources that met institutional expectations about expertise and authority. The recognition she'd sought, the opportunity to contribute her insights to defensive planning, had been achieved through proxy. Mitchell's team would present her conclusions as their own discoveries, earning credit for insights that would improve the base's security, while she remained in the communications center, processing intelligence for analysts who would never acknowledge the strategic value of her contributions. Her evening walk around the base perimeter took on new significance as she observed the defensive improvements that her intelligence had prompted. Additionally, guard positions, enhanced sensor networks, revised patrol schedules, all implemented based on recommendations that originated from her analysis, but were attributed to the regional command specialists. The improvements were necessary and would undoubtedly enhance base security, but they also represented a missed opportunity for the kind of strategic thinking that could have prevented the reconnaissance disaster and might be crucial for surviving the larger assault that her intelligence suggested was still coming. As she completed her circuit and returned to her quarters, Fay recognized that her frustration wasn't really about credit or recognition. It was about effectiveness and the institutional barriers that prevented the best available intelligence from being used to its full potential. Her analysis had finally been heard, but only after being filtered through a system that valued presentation over substance and authority over accuracy.
The morning after Mitchell's team completed their initial assessment, Fay noticed subtle changes in how her colleagues interacted with her. The changes were small enough to be dismissed as imagination, but collectively they created an atmosphere of unease that hadn't existed before the analyst's arrival. Sergeant Weber, normally friendly despite their limited interactions, seemed to avoid eye contact when they crossed paths in the communications building. Private Martinez, who typically exchanged polite greetings, hurried past her workspace without acknowledgement. Even Captain Morrison, her immediate supervisor, displayed a coolness that suggested conversations had taken place beyond her awareness. Major Harrison summoned Fay to his office on a Tuesday morning that began like any other, but would fundamentally alter her relationship with the command structure she'd served faithfully for over a year. The summons came through official channels, a formal request that left no doubt about the serious nature of the conversation ahead. Harrison's office reflected his personality and command philosophy. Maps dominated the walls, marked with precise annotations that demonstrated his systematic approach to tactical planning. His desk was organized with military precision, documents arranged in neat stacks that suggested a mind comfortable with hierarchy and procedure. Awards and commendations from a distinguished career provided silent testimony to his competence and dedication to service. But the man who greeted Fay seemed uncomfortable, as if the conversation ahead required him to address issues that challenged his preferred command style. Harrison had always treated her with professional respect, acknowledging her technical competence while maintaining appropriate command distance. Today, however, his manner suggested disappointment rather than routine administrative discussion. "Robinson, sit down." Harrison indicated a chair positioned across from his desk. The formal distance created by the furniture arrangement emphasized the official nature of their interaction. "We need to discuss your role here at Meridian and ensure that everyone understands their proper responsibilities." Fay recognized the tone immediately. This wasn't a performance review or technical consultation. This was a disciplinary conversation disguised as administrative guidance designed to address behavior that had attracted unfavorable attention from senior command. "Your technical performance continues to exceed standards," Harrison began, consulting a folder that undoubtedly contained detailed assessments of her work. "Your intelligence processing is thorough, your communication support is reliable, and your equipment maintenance is exemplary. These are valuable contributions that support our mission effectiveness." The praise felt ominous, delivered in a tone that clearly indicated it was preliminary to more serious concerns. Harrison's body language suggested he was fulfilling an unpleasant duty rather than recognizing successful performance. "However," he continued, "there are aspects of your conduct that have raised concerns among senior staff. Your analytical activities have exceeded your authorized responsibilities, and there are questions about your understanding of proper command channels and information security protocols." The accusations were delivered in the measured tones of official reprimand, but they carried implications that extended far beyond administrative correction. Fay was being formally warned that her analytical work,
regardless of its accuracy or value, was considered unauthorized activity that violated institutional boundaries. Sir, my analytical work has been directly related to my assigned intelligence processing duties. Understanding the strategic context of communications intelligence is necessary for effective technical processing and threat assessment. Harrison consulted his notes, clearly following guidance that had been prepared for this conversation. The concern isn't about understanding context, Robinson. The concern is about conducting strategic assessments that properly belong to designated intelligence personnel. Your reports demonstrate analytical depth that exceeds your authorized role. The fundamental disconnect was becoming clear. Harrison wasn't questioning her competence or accuracy. He was questioning her authority to develop insights that had proven more valuable than official assessments conducted by personnel with appropriate credentials. Strategic analysis requires command oversight and proper clearance levels, Harrison continued. When personnel exceed their authorized roles, even with good intentions, it creates security risks and undermines command structure. Intelligence must flow through proper channels to ensure accuracy and prevent unauthorized disclosure. Fay recognized the institutional logic, even as she understood its flaws. The system valued proper process over accurate analysis, appropriate credentials over demonstrated competence. Her unauthorized insights had been more accurate than official assessments, but accuracy was secondary to maintaining command structure and information security. Going forward, Harrison's tone became more directive. You will limit your activities to technical processing of assigned intelligence streams. Any analysis that extends beyond routine technical assessment must be conducted through proper command channels with appropriate oversight. The restriction was comprehensive and explicit. Fay was being ordered to limit her intellectual engagement with the intelligence she processed, to function as a technical resource rather than an analytical asset. Her strategic understanding, regardless of its accuracy or value, was considered unauthorized activity that violated proper military hierarchy. Additionally, Harrison continued, you are directed to discontinue any activities that could be construed as tactical reconnaissance or operational planning. Your evening activities around the base perimeter have been noted, and there are questions about the appropriateness of such behavior for personnel in your position. The revelation that her preparation activities had been observed added a new dimension to the warning. Her reconnaissance walks, her study of defensive positions, and her analysis of tactical capabilities were being interpreted as inappropriate curiosity rather than professional preparation. The system that had failed to utilize her insights was now suspicious of her efforts to develop capabilities that might be needed in crisis situations. Sir, I've been maintaining physical fitness and familiarizing myself with base facilities. Understanding our defensive capabilities seems relevant to communications support during emergency situations. Harrison's expression suggested that her explanation confirmed rather than addressed his concerns. Communications support during emergencies involves maintaining equipment and following established protocols. It doesn't require independent tactical assessment or unauthorized reconnaissance of defensive positions. The conversation continued with Harrison outlining specific behavioral expectations and professional boundaries that would govern her future activities. She was to process assigned intelligence without developing strategic assessments. She was to maintain communications equipment without analyzing tactical implications. She was to support base operations without exceeding her authorized role or developing unauthorized expertise. I want to be clear about this, Robinson, Harrison concluded, his tone carrying the weight of formal command authority. You possess valuable technical skills that contribute to our mission effectiveness, but those skills must be applied within proper boundaries and appropriate oversight. Any future activities that exceed your authorized role will be considered serious violations of military discipline. As Fay left Harrison's office, she understood that her institutional position had been fundamentally redefined.
Her competence had been acknowledged, but constrained. Her insights valued, but unauthorized. Her preparation dismissed as inappropriate curiosity rather than professional development. The timing of the restriction felt particularly cruel. Her analytical indication that insurgent forces were approaching the final phase of their preparatory activities, the coordinated assault she'd been predicting, was likely only days away, and her comprehensive understanding of enemy capabilities and tactical vulnerabilities would be crucial for effective defensive responses. But that understanding would now be officially irrelevant. She'd been ordered to limit her analytical activities and discontinue her tactical preparation. When the crisis came, she would be expected to function as a technical resource rather than a strategic asset, processing communications while others made decisions based on incomplete understanding of the intelligence picture. Her walk back to the communications center felt different now, observed by a command structure that viewed her curiosity as suspicious and her competence as threatening. The base that had been her professional home for over a year had become an institution that valued compliance over capability and proper process over effective results. The irony was that Harrison's warning came at the exact moment when her unauthorized insights might prove most valuable. The insurgent assault that her analytic had predicted was approaching, and the base would face its greatest challenge, defended by personnel who lacked comprehensive understanding of enemy capabilities and tactical intentions.
The attack came at 0347 hours on a Thursday morning that began with the distinctive whistle of incoming mortars and the sharp crack of explosions that shattered the pre-dawn quiet. Fay was awake instantly, her months of preparation allowing her to recognize the coordinated nature of the assault, even as sirens began wailing across the base. The first explosions targeted the communications center, the command building, and the main generator facility in a pattern that demonstrated sophisticated intelligence about base operations. These weren't random harassment attacks or probing actions, but precisely coordinated strikes designed to disrupt command and control capabilities while preparing for ground assault. Fay rolled from her cot and began dressing with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had rehearsed this moment dozens of times. Her gear was pre-positioned, her route to the communications center memorized, and her understanding of insurgent tactics comprehensive enough to predict their likely sequence of operations. As she moved through the base toward her assigned station, she observed chaos that confirmed her worst analytical predictions. The insurgent assault was unfolding exactly as her intelligence had suggested it would, with coordinated attacks designed to overwhelm defensive responses and create gaps that ground forces could exploit. The communications center had taken a direct hit that destroyed the primary transmission equipment and killed Sergeant Thompson, the night duty officer. Secondary systems were functional but operating at reduced capacity, limiting the base's ability to coordinate with supporting units or request emergency assistance. Captain Morrison appeared in the damaged communications center, his face grim as he surveyed the destruction. "Robinson, get the backup systems fully operational. We need to re-establish contact with regional command and coordinate defensive responses." Fay began working with the focused intensity that emergencies demanded, but her analytical mind was processing tactical implications that extended far beyond communications support. The attack pattern indicated this was the opening phase of a larger assault designed to isolate the base and prevent effective coordination with supporting forces. "Sir," she keyed her radio to address Morrison directly while continuing her work on the communications equipment. "The attack pattern suggests they're preparing for ground assault from multiple directions. The mortar strikes were designed to disrupt our command capabilities while their ground forces moved into position." Morrison nodded absently, his attention focused on immediate technical problems rather than broader tactical implications. "Just get us back in communication, Robinson. Command decisions will be made through proper channels once we can coordinate with regional headquarters." But regional headquarters wasn't responding to their transmission attempts, and the electronic warfare indicators on her monitoring equipment suggested that insurgent forces were conducting sophisticated jamming operations designed to prevent NATO coordination. The base was being systematically isolated, cut off from supporting forces, and forced to defend itself with limited resources and degraded communications. As dawn approached, the tactical situation became increasingly clear to Fay,
even as it remained opaque to the surviving command structure. Major Harrison had been wounded in the initial mortar attack and evacuated to the medical facility. Macomski's scout team had been caught in the destruction of the command building, with 2 casualties and their equipment destroyed. The senior leadership that would normally coordinate defensive responses had been effectively neutralized by the opening phase of the assault. Lieutenant Colonel Brennan, now the senior officer present for duty, established a temporary command post in the medical facility and began attempting to organize defensive responses based on incomplete information and limited communications capabilities. His decisions were competent but reactive, addressing immediate tactical problems without understanding the broader strategic framework that guided insurgent operations. All units, consolidate defensive positions around the main compound, establish overlapping fields of fire, and prepare for ground assault from the northern approaches. Brennan's voice crackled through the damaged communications system. Fay recognized immediately that Brennan's defensive strategy was based on conventional tactical thinking that didn't account for insurgent capabilities and intentions. Her analysis indicated that the ground assault would come from multiple directions simultaneously, designed to overwhelm defensive responses and create gaps that follow-on forces could exploit. The northern approaches that Brennan was prioritizing represented only one axis of the coordinated attack. Insurgent forces had positioned themselves to assault the base from 4 different directions, using terrain features and approach routes that Fay had identified during her unauthorized reconnaissance activities. "Sir," she keyed her radio to address Brennan directly while continuing her work on the communications equipment. "The attack pattern suggests they're preparing for ground assault from multiple directions. They're not just attacking from the north, they're executing a coordinated envelopment designed to overwhelm our defensive positions." Brennan's response carried the irritation of a commander dealing with technical personnel who didn't understand their proper role. "Robinson, focus on maintaining communications. Tactical analysis will be conducted by appropriate personnel through proper command channels." But there were no appropriate personnel available to conduct tactical analysis. The intelligence specialists had been casualties of the initial attack, the senior leadership was wounded or dead, and the surviving officers were making decisions based on incomplete information and conventional tactical assumptions that didn't account for insurgent capabilities. As the morning progressed and the ground assault began to develop, Fay watched the defensive response unfold with growing horror. Brennan's forces were positioned to repel attacks that weren't coming, while failing to defend against threats that her analysis had predicted weeks earlier. The insurgent ground forces approached from exactly the routes she had identified, using terrain features and tactical techniques that she had documented in reports that had been filed away and forgotten. Their assault was unfolding according to a plan that her intelligence could have countered if anyone with command authority had been willing to listen to strategic assessments from a communications specialist. From her position in the damaged communications center, she could monitor radio traffic from defensive positions around the base. The reports painted a picture of tactical surprise and increasing desperation as insurgent forces appeared where they weren't expected and attacked with capabilities that hadn't been anticipated. "Contact south perimeter, multiple insurgents with heavy weapons. Request immediate reinforcement. We're being overwhelmed. Eastern checkpoint under coordinated assault. They knew exactly where our positions were, came right through our blind spots. Command, this is Northern Observation Post. No activity in our sector, but we can see muzzle flashes from attacks on positions we can't support. They're hitting us everywhere except where we expected them." Each report confirmed Fay's analytical predictions while demonstrating the inadequacy of defensive preparations based on conventional tactical thinking. The base was losing a battle that could have been won if her intelligence had been properly utilized and her strategic assessments had been incorporated into defensive planning. As explosions grew closer and radio reports became more desperate, Fay recognized that the crisis that she had been preparing for had finally arrived. The base faced destruction or surrender unless someone could organize effective responses based on comprehensive understanding of insurgent capabilities and tactical intentions. The institutional barriers that had constrained her analytical activities were now irrelevant. Proper command channels had been disrupted, appropriate personnel had been killed or wounded, and the authorized decision-makers were operating with incomplete information that was leading to tactical disaster. For the first time in her military career, Fay faced a situation where her unauthorized insights might be the difference between survival and defeat. The question was whether she possessed the courage to act on her analysis despite explicit orders to limit her activities to technical support functions.
By 0800 hours, the systematic failure of conventional defensive responses had become undeniably apparent. Lieutenant Colonel Brennan's command post in the medical facility buzzed with increasingly desperate radio communications from defensive positions that were being overrun or bypassed, according to insurgent tactical plans that seemed to anticipate every NATO countermove. Northern Perimeter reports no contact, but Southern Checkpoint is being overwhelmed by coordinated assault, Staff Sergeant Williams reported, his voice tight with stress as he tried to make sense of conflicting tactical reports. Eastern positions are taking indirect fire from positions we don't have identified, and Western approaches are showing movement but no direct engagement. Brennan studied the tactical map with growing frustration, trying to understand attack patterns that defied conventional military logic. The insurgent assault wasn't following textbook procedures or approaching from predictable directions. Instead, they seemed to possess detailed intelligence about base defenses and were exploiting vulnerabilities that standard tactical assessment hadn't identified. Deploy reserve forces to reinforce Southern Checkpoint, Brennan ordered, attempting to address the most immediate tactical crisis. And get me communication with Regional Command. We need air support and reinforcement if we're going to hold this position. But Regional Command remained unreachable through conventional channels, and the reserve forces that Brennan was deploying represented the last uncommitted resources available for defensive operations. Once those reserves were engaged, the base would have no flexibility to respond to additional threats or tactical developments. Fay monitored these exchanges from her position in the damaged communications center, watching competent officers make reasonable decisions based on incomplete information that was leading inevitably toward tactical defeat. Her unauthorized analysis had predicted exactly the sequence of events, but that analysis had been dismissed as unauthorized activity that exceeded her proper role. The fundamental problem wasn't incompetence or cowardice among the base's defenders. The problem was systematic inability to understand insurgent capabilities and intentions because the intelligence that could have provided that understanding had been ignored or constrained by institutional barriers that valued process over results. Captain Morrison appeared in the communications center, his face showing the strain of trying to coordinate defensive responses with degraded equipment and limited information. Robinson, any success reestablishing contact with supporting units. We need to understand the broader tactical picture and coordinate our response accordingly. Sir, insurgent jamming is preventing normal communications with Regional Command, but I can provide tactical analysis based on intelligence patterns I've been monitoring. The attack is following predicted sequences that suggest they're implementing a comprehensive plan designed to isolate and overwhelm our defensive capabilities. Morrison nodded absently, his attention focused on technical problems rather than tactical implications. Keep working on communications, Robinson. Once we reestablish contact with higher command, we'll have access to proper intelligence and tactical guidance. But higher command wasn't responding. Proper intelligence wasn't available, and tactical guidance was being developed by officers who lacked comprehensive understanding of insurgent capabilities and base vulnerabilities. The system that was supposed to provide strategic direction and coordinate effective responses had been systematically neutralized by an enemy that understood NATO procedures better than NATO understood insurgent contentions. As the morning progressed, the inadequacy of conventional responses became increasingly apparent through radio reports from defensive positions around the base. Unit commanders were fighting bravely but blindly, responding to immediate tactical threats without understanding the broader strategic framework that guided insurgent operations. Medical facility reports wounded from Southern Perimeter, came one transmission. Casualties are describing coordinated assault by forces that knew exact positions of our defensive emplacements. Eastern Checkpoint abandoned after coordinated mortar and small arms attack, reported another voice. Insurgents used approach routes that bypassed all of our observation positions. Reserve forces deploying to Southern Perimeter are taking casualties from indirect fire positions that aren't on our tactical maps. Enemy seems to have detailed knowledge of our movement routes and defensive procedures.
Each report confirmed that the insurgent assault was succeeding because it was based on superior intelligence and comprehensive tactical planning that had anticipated NATO responses and prepared countermeasures for every defensive action. The base was losing not because its defenders lacked courage or competence, but because they were fighting an enemy that understood their capabilities and limitations better than they understood their own tactical situation. Lieutenant Colonel Brennan's increasingly desperate attempts to coordinate effective responses highlighted the fundamental problem. He was making decisions based on standard tactical doctrine and conventional intelligence estimates that didn't account for insurgent capabilities and strategic intentions. All remaining units consolidate around the main compound, establish final defensive perimeter, and prepare for coordinated withdrawal if reinforcement doesn't arrive within the next 2 hours. The order represented acknowledgement that conventional defensive responses had failed and that the base was preparing for evacuation or surrender. 200 soldiers were being defeated by a smaller insurgent force because institutional barriers had prevented effective use of available intelligence and tactical expertise. From her position in the communications center, Fay could see the tactical situation with clarity that eluded the surviving command structure. The insurgent assault was proceeding according to plans that her analysis had predicted, using capabilities that her intelligence had documented, and exploiting vulnerabilities that her reconnaissance had identified. The base possessed the knowledge necessary to mount effective defensive responses, but that knowledge had been dismissed as unauthorized activity conducted by personnel who exceeded their proper role. The system had valued appropriate credentials over accurate analysis, proper process over effective results, and institutional hierarchy over tactical competence. As explosions grew closer and radio reports became more desperate, Fay recognized the moment of ultimate crisis was approaching. The base would fall unless someone could organize responses based on comprehensive understanding of insurgent capabilities and base vulnerabilities. The conventional command structure had proven inadequate to the challenge, and proper channels had been disrupted by enemy action designed specifically to neutralize NATO decision-making processes. The institutional barriers that had constrained her analytical activities were now irrelevant because the institution itself was failing. Authorization was meaningless when authorized personnel were dead or wounded. Proper channels were useless when those channels had been systematically destroyed. Appropriate oversight was impossible when appropriate personnel were making decisions based on incomplete information that was leading to tactical disaster. For the first time since arriving at Forward Operating Base Meridian, Fay faced a situation where her unauthorized expertise might be the only thing standing between survival and defeat.
At 0945 hours, with insurgent forces closing on the main compound and conventional defensive responses collapsing around the perimeter, Fay Robinson faced the defining choice of her military career. Lieutenant Colonel Brennan's final defensive perimeter was contracting under coordinated pressure from multiple directions, and his preparations for evacuation or surrender were proceeding with the grim efficiency of a commander who understood that conventional options had been exhausted. Standing in the damaged communications center, surrounded by equipment she could repair but wasn't authorized to use for tactical coordination, Fay possessed comprehensive understanding of both insurgent capabilities and base defensive resources that could still turn the tactical situation around. But utilizing that understanding would require her to violate every institutional boundary that had constrained her activities for the past year. The moment crystallized when Private Matthews burst into the communications center, his face blackened with smoke from the fighting at the southern perimeter. "Robinson, we need communication with whoever's in charge. Our position is being overrun and we've lost contact with command. The whole defense is falling apart." Through her monitoring equipment, Fay could hear the radio traffic that confirmed Matthews' assessment. Defensive positions were being abandoned in sequence as coordinated insurgent assaults overwhelmed isolated strongpoints that couldn't support each other. The tactical situation was following exactly the pattern her analysis had predicted, with insurgent forces exploiting gaps and vulnerabilities that she had identified but hadn't been authorized to address. "Where's Lieutenant Colonel Brennan?" Matthews continued, his voice tight with stress. We need orders. We need coordination. We need someone to tell us what the hell is happening out there. Command post is in the medical facility, Fay replied, while her mind processed tactical implications that extended far beyond answering Matthews' immediate questions. But they're operating with incomplete information and conventional tactical assumptions that don't account for insurgent capabilities. Matthews stared at her, processing words that suggested knowledge and authority that didn't match her official position. What do you mean, insurgent capabilities? Your communications, right? How do you know what they're capable of? The question forced Fay to confront the fundamental choice that had been building for months. She could direct Matthews to the official command structure and continue functioning as a technical resource while the base fell to an enemy whose tactics she understood better than anyone else present for duty. Or she could acknowledge her unauthorized expertise and begin coordinating responses based on comprehensive understanding of the tactical situation. I've been analyzing their communications and tactical patterns for months. They're implementing a coordinated plan designed to overwhelm our conventional responses by exploiting vulnerabilities in our defensive procedures and command structure. You predicted this? Matthews asked, his voice carrying disbelief that someone with her quiet manner and technical role could possess strategic insights that had eluded senior leadership. I documented it. I reported it. I recommended countermeasures that could have prevented exactly what's happening right now. But strategic analysis conducted by communications personnel isn't considered actionable intelligence. Matthews looked around the damaged communications center, taking in the sophisticated monitoring equipment and detailed tactical maps that suggested capabilities far beyond routine technical support. Can you stop this? Do you know how to coordinate a defense that might actually work? The question hung in the air like smoke from the explosions that were growing steadily closer. They possessed detailed knowledge of insurgent tactical plans, comprehensive understanding of base defensive capabilities, and strategic insights that could coordinate effective responses to the coordinated assault. But utilizing that understanding would require her to assume command authority that she didn't officially possess and hadn't been granted. I can coordinate responses based on accurate intelligence about enemy capabilities and intentions, Fay replied carefully, but that would require personnel to follow tactical guidance from someone without proper command authority or official credentials. Right now, I'll follow tactical guidance from anyone who understands what we're facing, because whatever we're doing isn't working, and if you've got better ideas, I want to hear them. The moment of choice arrived with crystalline clarity. Fay could continue operating within the institutional constraints that had limited her activities for months, processing communications while authorized personnel made decisions that were leading to tactical defeat. Or she could act on her unauthorized analysis and begin coordinating defensive responses based on comprehensive understanding of the tactical situation. She thought about Major Harrison's explicit warning to limit her activities to technical support functions. She considered Captain Morrison's directive to maintain appropriate boundaries and avoid exceeding her authorized role. She reflected on months of institutional messages that her insights, regardless of their accuracy, were unauthorized activities that violated proper military hierarchy. But she also thought about the radio reports from defensive positions that were being overrun according to insurgent plans she had predicted. She considered the wounded soldiers being evacuated from strongpoints that could have been held if her intelligence had been properly utilized. She reflected on the systematic failure of conventional responses that were based on incomplete understanding of enemy capabilities and tactical intentions. Matthews, Fay said, her voice carrying new authority that reflected months of suppressed strategic thinking. Get me contact with every defensive position that's still operational, and find anyone with communications equipment who can relay tactical coordination to personnel who might be willing to follow guidance that could actually work. You're taking command? Matthews asked, seeking confirmation that someone was finally prepared to act on superior understanding of the tactical situation. I'm providing tactical coordination based on accurate intelligence about enemy capabilities and intentions, Fay replied, beginning to access communication channels that she'd been monitoring but hadn't been authorized to use for command purposes. Whether anyone follows that coordination will depend on whether they want to survive this assault or continue following procedures that are systematically failing. As Fay departed to establish communication links with surviving defensive positions, she began the process of translating her unauthorized analysis into actionable tactical guidance. For the first time since arriving at Forward Operating Base Meridian, she was prepared to use her comprehensive understanding of the tactical situation to coordinate responses that might actually prove effective against an enemy she understood better than anyone else present for duty.
Within minutes of making her decision to provide tactical coordination, Fay found herself operating in violation of every institutional boundary that had constrained her activities throughout her deployment. She activated communication channels that she'd been monitoring but never authorized to use for command purposes, accessed tactical databases that exceeded her clearance level, and began issuing guidance that assumed authority she didn't officially possess. The first test of her unauthorized command came when Sergeant Rodriguez responded to her transmission from the Eastern defensive position. "Who is this? I need proper authentication before accepting tactical guidance from unknown command elements." "Sergeant Rodriguez, this is Specialist Robinson from Communications," Fay replied, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was attempting. "I have comprehensive intelligence about insurgent tactical plans and can provide coordination that might prevent your position from being overrun." The silence that followed her identification lasted long enough for Fay to wonder if Rodriguez would simply terminate communication and continue following conventional procedures that were systematically failing. When his voice returned, it carried the desperation of someone who recognized that standard approaches were leading to tactical defeat. "Robinson, your communications personnel, what do you know about tactical coordination?" "I know that insurgent forces are approaching your position from the southeast using the drainage covert that runs beneath the access road," Fay replied, consulting the detailed terrain analysis she'd developed during months of unauthorized reconnaissance. "They'll attempt to breach your perimeter at 10-15 hours using covering fire from positions you haven't identified because they're not on standard tactical maps." Rodriguez was quiet again, presumably checking his position against information that shouldn't have been available to communications personnel. "How do you know about the drainage culvert? That's not in any of the briefing materials we received." "I've been conducting comprehensive analysis of insurgent capabilities and base vulnerabilities," Fay replied, abandoning any pretense that her activities had been limited to authorized technical support. "If you want to hold your position, you need to reposition your primary defensive fire to cover the culvert approach and establish observation posts at coordinates I can provide." The moment stretched while Rodriguez weighed the choice between following guidance from unauthorized personnel or continuing with defensive procedures that had already failed at multiple positions around the base perimeter. His decision would establish precedent for whether other defenders would accept tactical coordination from someone whose expertise had been systematically dismissed by conventional command structure. "Give me the coordinates," Rodriguez finally replied, his voice carrying resignation mixed with hope. "Because what we're doing isn't working, and if you've got better intelligence, I need to hear it." Over the next 20 minutes, Fay established tactical communication with 7 defensive positions that were still operational, providing each commander with specific intelligence about insurgent approach routes, timing, and capabilities. Her guidance was based on months of analysis that conventional assessment had missed, offering defensive alternatives that could counter insurgent advantages and exploit opportunities for tactical success that had been impossible under degraded command structure. "The Northern Observation Post, this is tactical coordination. she transmitted to Corporal Williams, using identification that implied authority without claiming official command status. Insurgent forces are bypassing your position to attack the main compound from the northwest. You can interdict their movement by repositioning to grid reference 347821 and establishing overlapping fire with the reserve position at the medical facility. Each transmission represented escalation of her unauthorized activities, but also demonstrated the effectiveness of coordination based on comprehensive understanding of the tactical situation. Defensive positions that had been isolated and overwhelmed under conventional command were beginning to coordinate responses that accounted for insurgent capabilities and exploited opportunities that standard tactical assessment had missed. The breakthrough came when Private Matthews returned with communication links established to personnel throughout the base who were willing to accept tactical guidance regardless of its source. Robinson, I've got contact with mechanics, medical personnel, logistics specialists, and support staff who aren't engaged in the perimeter defense. They want to know if you can organize them into effective support for the defensive positions. Fay recognized the opportunity immediately. The base contained dozens of personnel with combat training and valuable skills who weren't being utilized because they weren't assigned to designated combat roles. Her unauthorized analysis of personnel capabilities had identified resources that could be crucial for coordinated defensive responses. Matthews, contact Specialist Chen in the medical facility. She has combat medic training and can organize casualty evacuation that support defensive positions. Find Private Johnson from vehicle maintenance. He has demolitions experience and can prepare obstacles that channel insurgent movement into prepared killing zones. As she continued coordinating responses that utilized hidden capabilities and resources throughout the base, she recognized that she had crossed definitively beyond any possibility of institutional forgiveness. Her activities now constituted assumption of command authority without proper authorization, tactical coordination that exceeded her clearance level, and strategic decision-making that violated every boundary that had been explicitly established for her role. But her unauthorized coordination was also producing results that conventional command had been unable to achieve. Defensive positions were beginning to coordinate effective responses to insurgent pressure. Support personnel were being organized into capabilities that enhanced overall defensive effectiveness. Intelligence that had been ignored was finally being utilized to counter insurgent advantages and exploit opportunities for tactical success. The radio traffic monitoring her unauthorized command net revealed growing confidence among personnel who were finally receiving tactical guidance based on accurate intelligence and comprehensive understanding of the situation they faced. Voices that had carried desperation under conventional command were beginning to show determination as coordinated responses proved effective against insurgent tactical plans. Tactical coordination. This is Rodriguez at Eastern Checkpoint. Your intelligence about insurgent approach routes was accurate. We interdicted their movement through the drainage covert and prevented breach of our perimeter. Request additional guidance for follow-on operations. This is Williams at Northern Observation. Repositioning according to your coordinates allowed us to establish effective fire on insurgent forces approaching the main compound. They're withdrawing to covered positions and appear to be reassessing their tactical approach. Each success report confirmed that her unauthorized analysis had been superior to conventional assessment, and that tactical coordination based on comprehensive intelligence could counter insurgent advantages that had overwhelmed standard defensive responses. But success also meant that there would be no possibility of returning to her previous role as a constrained communication specialist who processed information without interpreting its strategic implications. Lieutenant Colonel Brennan, the voice cut through the tactical communications that Fay was coordinating. This is Base Commander. Who is providing tactical guidance to defensive positions? I need immediate identification of personnel assuming command authority without proper authorization. The moment of ultimate confrontation had arrived. Fay could attempt to deflect responsibility and return to authorized activities, or she could acknowledge her assumption of tactical command and accept the consequences of violating institutional boundaries that had constrained her throughout her deployment. "Sir, this is Specialist Robinson coordinating defensive responses based on intelligence analysis that I've been developing. Current tactical coordination is proving effective against insurgent capabilities that conventional assessment failed to anticipate."
Brennan's response carried the sharp edge of command authority under challenge. "Robinson, you are ordered to cease all tactical coordination immediately. You are not authorized for command functions, and your activities constitute serious violations of military discipline." "Sir, current coordination is preventing tactical collapse and casualties that would result from continued reliance on conventional responses that insurgent forces have systematically countered," Fay replied, continuing to monitor tactical communications while addressing Brennan's challenge to her authority. The confrontation highlighted the fundamental tension between institutional hierarchy and battlefield effectiveness that had constrained her activities throughout her deployment. Brennan represented legitimate command authority and proper military procedures, but his conventional approach had proven inadequate to the tactical challenges they faced. "All positions, this is base commander. Disregard tactical guidance from unauthorized personnel. Return to standard defensive procedures and report to designated command channels for coordination." Fay watched her communication net as defensive commanders faced the choice between following official orders that had already failed or continuing with unauthorized coordination that was proving effective against insurgent tactical plans. The decision would determine whether the base could maintain coordinated responses or would fragment into isolated positions that could be defeated in sequence. Sergeant Rodriguez was the first to respond, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had experienced both approaches to tactical command. "Sir, with respect, unauthorized coordination has provided intelligence and tactical guidance that prevented breach of our perimeter. Request permission to continue current tactical approach." "Rodriguez, you will follow orders from proper command authority. Terminate unauthorized communications and report status through official channels." But Rodriguez didn't terminate communications with Fay's tactical coordination net. Instead, his voice appeared on her unauthorized frequency with determination that suggested professional judgment overriding institutional constraints. "Tactical coordination, this is Rodriguez, maintaining current defensive positions and requesting continued intelligence support. Official command approach has been ineffective against current threat." One by one, other defensive commanders made similar decisions to continue following tactical guidance that was proving effective rather than returning to conventional approaches that had systematically failed. Their choice represented collective recognition that battlefield success was more important than institutional hierarchy when survival was at stake. Corporal Williams at the Northern Observation Post was direct in his assessment. "Robinson, your intelligence has been accurate and your coordination has been effective. I'll follow tactical guidance that works rather than procedures that get people killed." Private Matthews coordinated support personnel according to Fay's organizational plan rather than Brennan's orders to return to standard roles. "Tactical coordination, support elements are positioned according to your guidance. Medical evacuation capabilities are established, and engineering obstacles are being prepared according to your tactical assessment." Fay recognized that she was now leading a coordinated defensive response that operated parallel to official command structure rather than within it. Her tactical coordination was proving effective because it was based on superior intelligence and comprehensive understanding of insurgent capabilities, but it also represented systematic violation of institutional hierarchy and command authority.
The insurgent response to coordinated defensive resistance revealed the effectiveness of her unauthorized approach. Radio intercepts indicated confusion among insurgent forces who had expected to continue overwhelming isolated defensive positions, according to their intelligence about NATO tactical procedures. Enemy communications indicate they're requesting tactical reassessment, Fay transmitted to her coordination net. Their operational plan assumed continued NATO reliance on conventional defensive responses that they had prepared countermeasures for. Coordinated resistance, based on accurate intelligence about their capabilities, is forcing them to improvise rather than executing prepared tactical sequences. Her analysis proved accurate as insurgent assault operations began to lose coordination and effectiveness. Forces that had advanced according to careful tactical planning were now facing defensive responses that anticipated their capabilities and countered their advantages through superior intelligence and coordinated resistance. By 11:30 hours, the tactical situation had shifted decisively in favor of the base defenders. Insurgent forces that had been systematically overwhelming NATO positions were now withdrawing to defensive positions while attempting to understand how their carefully prepared tactical plans had been countered by intelligence that shouldn't have been available to NATO forces. Enemy communications indicate they're withdrawing to covered positions and establishing defensive perimeter, Rodriguez reported through Fay's tactical net. Request guidance for follow-on operations and pursuit of retreating enemy forces. Fay consulted her comprehensive analysis of insurgent capabilities and terrain features that would influence pursuit operations. Negative on immediate pursuit. Enemy withdrawal is tactical repositioning rather than retreat. They're establishing defensive positions at grid references I can provide and preparing for renewed assault with revised tactical approach. Her assessment proved correct when insurgent forces attempted a second coordinated assault 2 hours later, only to be repelled by defensive positions that had been repositioned according to her intelligence analysis. The base that had been facing defeat or evacuation at 0900 hours was now successfully defending against repeated assault by forces whose tactical plans had been systematically countered. Lieutenant Colonel Brennan's voice returned to official communication channels with grudging acknowledgement of tactical reality. All positions maintain current defensive status, continue tactical coordination through all available channels until threat situation has been resolved. The authorization came too late to restore institutional legitimacy to Fay's coordination, but it represented official recognition that her unauthorized approach had proven more effective than conventional command procedures. She had led 50 soldiers through successful defensive operations that prevented tactical defeat and maintained base security against coordinated insurgent assault. As afternoon settled over Forward Operating Base Meridian, Fay continued coordinating defensive responses while understanding that her actions had fundamentally altered her relationship with the military institution she had served faithfully for over 2 years. Her success had vindicated her analytical capabilities and strategic insights, but had also demonstrated systematic failures in institutional approaches to intelligence assessment and tactical command.